The 2026 World Cup hasn't even kicked off yet, but somewhere out there, things are already going sideways. A national team stuck at the airport because their visas didn't come through. Fans canceling trips that cost thousands of dollars. Final match tickets priced so high that most people couldn't even dream of affording them. Test events getting hammered by extreme weather. Hotels and host cities sitting half empty when they should be packed solid. Sounds impossible, right? How does the biggest sporting event on the planet run into this many problems before a single ball is kicked? But maybe that's not even the right question anymore. Maybe the real question isn't what's happening with the World Cup. Maybe the real question is what's happening to America. Let's go back to 2018. If you'd told a soccer fan then that the 2026 World Cup would become this controversial, they probably would have laughed. When FIFA announced that the United States, Canada, and Mexico would co-host the tournament, most people nodded along like it was the obvious call. Nobody was debating visas. Nobody was worried about tourists staying home. Nobody was asking whether fans would feel welcome. At the time, this felt like the safest, most sensible decision FIFA could have made. And honestly, it wasn't hard to understand why. The United States has some of the largest stadiums on the planet, venues that hold anywhere from tens of thousands to well over 100,000 people. The major cities are connected through one of the busiest air travel networks anywhere in the world. The country has decades of experience hosting massive events, from the Super Bowl to the Olympics to the FIFA World Cup itself. The U.S. hosted it in 1994, and that tournament still holds records for average attendance. Experts at the time of the bid were predicting the 2026 World Cup could generate tens of billions of dollars in economic activity and become the largest World Cup in the history of the sport by nearly every measure: attendance, viewership, commercial revenue, and scale. In other words, FIFA wasn't just selling the world a football tournament, they were selling a dream: packed stadiums, festival cities buzzing for weeks, America throwing open its doors to millions of fans from every corner of the globe. That was the vision. And what made people so optimistic wasn't that the U.S. is the world's most passionate soccer country. Everyone knows that's not exactly true. What made people hopeful was the belief that if any nation had the sheer resources and organizational capacity to pull off something at this scale, it was the United States. A country built like a gigantic, perfectly calibrated machine where every gear turns at exactly the right moment. But then time passed, the world changed, cost of living through the roof, society more fractured than it's been in generations, international travel that no longer works the way it used to, and most importantly, trust, that quiet, invisible currency that holds everything together, starting to erode in ways both big and almost imperceptibly small. There's a saying you hear in engineering circles: a bridge doesn't collapse on the day the first crack appears. It collapses after years of small cracks that nobody bothered to notice. For a lot of people following the 2026 World Cup, that's exactly what this situation feels like. Not one single catastrophic failure, just too many strange signs appearing at the same time, all pointing in the same direction. A few years ago, the conversation was about a flood of tourists pouring into the U.S. Today, the conversation is about canceled trips. A few years ago, people talked about a global party atmosphere. Today, people are talking about barriers, costs, and uncertainty. And that's why more and more people are starting to ask, what exactly changed? If the first part of this story is about promises, the second part is where we have to look at reality. And the strangest thing is that the first signs something was going wrong didn't show up in a stadium. They didn't appear on a scoreboard. They appeared in the most basic, fundamental part of any World Cup. How do you actually get people there? Start with South Africa. This is a team set to play in the opening match, one of the most visible, most anticipated moments of the entire tournament. But before South African officials could even begin thinking about tactics or training schedules, they ran into a completely different kind of problem. Players and coaching staff were stuck at airports because their paperwork hadn't been processed in time. Visas held up in bureaucratic limbo that shouldn't even exist for participants in the world's premier sporting event. You might hear that and think, annoying administrative hiccup happens all the time. But think carefully about what it actually means. If a national team, backed by a federation, backed by a government, backed by the entire organizational machinery of the World Cup. If that team is struggling to get through the door, what does that say to an ordinary family in Lagos or Bogota or Bangkok who just wants to buy a ticket and watch some soccer? By June 2026, the chaos had spread far beyond individual cases. As NPR reported, U.S. immigration policies under the Trump administration were already actively impacting the tournament. Over 40 members of various Moroccan football associations had their visas denied despite having valid tickets and hotel reservations in hand. According to visa tracking data and independent analysis, rejection rates for fans from several qualified nations had exceeded 40%. That's not a bureaucratic glitch. That's a structural barrier built into the entry system itself. And then there are the travel bans. 12 countries are subject to full travel bans that block all immigrant and non-immigrant visas. 7 more countries face partial restrictions, covering most categories of non-immigrant travel. The practical effect is that ticket-holding fans from over a dozen qualifying nations have essentially been told, you cannot come. Not that your application might face delays or scrutiny, just, you cannot come. No exceptions for sports tourists. No fast track for people who have demonstrably purchased tickets to an internationally recognized event. The policy doesn't bend for the World Cup. There's also the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The national team had to overhaul their entire preparation schedule because of disease control measures, even though the vast majority of their players were based in Europe, nowhere near the affected region. Friendly matches disrupted, training plans thrown into chaos. The road to a World Cup became significantly more complicated before a single minute of competitive play happened. This is the kind of logistical interference that, in isolation, looks like an unlucky circumstance. In the context of everything else happening simultaneously, it's another thread in the same fraying fabric. Then FIFA launched the FIFA Fan ID Pass, marketed as a kind of golden ticket to make the entire entry process smoother and more streamlined for international attendees. The reality was considerably less impressive. The program only helped ticket holders schedule a visa appointment a little faster. It didn't guarantee visa approval. It didn't guarantee entry into the country. It changed absolutely nothing about the underlying process that was already creating so much anxiety. What was sold as a solution didn't address what fans were actually afraid of, which was never the scheduling, it was the outcome. And that's when a quiet, corrosive emotion started spreading through the global fan community. Not outrage, not panic. Something worse, hesitation. Comment sections of World Cup videos started filling up with the same question, written in dozens of languages, from dozens of countries. If I spend thousands of dollars planning this trip, can I actually be confident it's going to happen? In behavioral psychology, there's well-documented evidence that uncertainty is often harder to process than a clear negative outcome. Tell someone no and they can adapt, adjust, find an alternative. Tell someone we don't know and watch how much harder that is to live with. That ambient uncertainty became one of the dominant emotional experiences of World Cup planning in 2026. Not the cost, not the distance, the not knowing. Now, let's talk about tickets. When most people hear the phrase World Cup problems, their minds go straight to ticket prices. And fair enough, the numbers are genuinely extraordinary. In December 2025, FIFA put tickets on general sale with prices ranging from $140 for the cheapest group stage games all the way up to $8,680 for the World Cup final. The cheapest seat available for the final was $4,185. The most expensive was $8,680 for a single ticket at one match. Football supporters. Europe, the pan-European organization representing fan groups across the continent, called it a monumental betrayal of everything soccer was supposed to stand for. They filed a formal complaint with the European Commission, accusing FIFA of exploiting its dominant position to impose what they described as exorbitant prices combined with unclear and unjust purchasing conditions. Consumer group Euroconsumers joined the complaint, and by March 2026, this had escalated from a public relations problem into a formal legal and regulatory proceeding. To make the numbers concrete, if a single fan wanted to attend one match in each of the 8 rounds of the tournament, group stage through the final, The total cost at the lowest available ticket tier would run to roughly $5,225. At the middle tier, $8,580. At the highest price tier, $12,350. Those are Football Supporters Europe's own calculations, submitted as part of their formal complaint to the European Commission. FIFA responded to the avalanche of criticism by announcing $60 tickets for every round of the tournament, including the final, to be distributed through national federations to their most loyal supporters. Sounds generous until you read the actual terms. Those discounted seats represented just 10% of each team's ticket allocation per match. For every 100 tickets in a national federation's allocation, 10 could be sold at $60. The remaining 90 would face the full market rate, subject to the dynamic pricing system FIFA was employing for the first time at a World Cup, meaning prices could keep rising as matches approached and excitement built. But here's the thing that's worth sitting with. Ticket prices, staggering as they are, have never been the complete story. If you read through thousands of fan comments about the 2026 World Cup, something surprising emerges. Most of the frustration isn't purely about money. People are willing to pay extraordinary amounts for experiences they deeply value. A Taylor Swift concert, a once-in-a-lifetime Olympic trip, a chance to see their national team compete on the world stage. Money has always been a barrier to attending major sporting events. It has never, on its own, been the reason fans walk away from something they love. What feels different this time is the widespread sense that the World Cup is no longer designed with ordinary fans as the intended audience. There is a vast difference between not having enough money and not feeling welcome. The second one lands completely differently. It's like being invited to a celebration you've been anticipating for years, spending months planning your trip, saving up, and then standing at the door and slowly realizing that you were never actually on the guest list, that the door was always meant for someone else. That's the emotional register of many global soccer fans heading into the summer of 2026. Not just priced out, something closer to pushed out. And when people feel pushed out of something they love, they don't always argue about it publicly. They just quietly change their plans. Now, let's talk about hotels, because the economics here tell a story nobody in the American tourism industry was expecting. Early projections for the 2026 World Cup were extraordinary. Economic analyses published just a few years back predicted a massive tourism windfall. Hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars in hospitality revenue flowing into host cities across the country. The model seems straightforward: the largest World Cup in history, hosted in the richest country on earth, with the biggest stadiums and the most developed infrastructure. The math appeared obvious. The reality, as of spring 2026, looks starkly different. According to a survey conducted by the American Hotel and Lodging Association in April 2026, nearly 80% of hotels in the 11 U.S. host cities reported that reservations were tracking below initial forecasts. In Kansas City, between 85 and 90% of hotel operators reported lower than anticipated bookings. In Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Seattle, major American cities with world-class hospitality infrastructure, the same pattern repeated itself, below projections, in some cases significantly so. The Financial Times, citing data from the analytics firm Lighthouse Intelligence, reported that game day room rates in major host cities, including Atlanta, Dallas, Miami, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, had actually fallen 30% from where they stood at the beginning of the year. Think about what that means. Hotel operators were lowering prices in an attempt to attract demand, and bookings still weren't materializing at the volumes that had been projected for years. The economic engine was running, but it was running cold. Analysts consistently pointed to two primary causes. First, the restrictive immigration environment under the Trump administration was directly deterring international fans from committing to trips to the United States. The visa uncertainty, the travel bans, the very public messaging around border enforcement, all of it contributed to a risk perception that made the U.S. a less appealing destination compared to the Canadian and Mexican portions of the co-host arrangement. Second, broader geopolitical tensions, particularly U.S.-Iran relations, but also general friction between the current administration and major soccer-playing nations, We're dampening demand across entire regions that would otherwise have sent substantial numbers of soccer fans to North America. Here's the paradox at the heart of all this. America isn't lacking stadiums. It isn't short on hotel rooms or airport capacity. The infrastructure exists at a scale that genuinely no other country on earth could match. The seats are there, the beds are there, the roads, the airports, the logistics, all there. What isn't there, in sufficient quantities, is the willingness to show up. And this is a distinction that matters enormously, because you can build more infrastructure, but you cannot build demand through infrastructure alone. There is something quietly profound happening beneath the statistical surface of all this, and it comes back to the question of trust. Not just trust in FIFA, though that's certainly part of it. Trust in America as a destination. Trust in the idea, the whole concept, that America is a place the world is genuinely invited to enter. For generations, the United States occupied a specific symbolic place in the global imagination. It wasn't just a country. It was a destination that carried meaning, a place associated with possibility, with openness, with the notion that you could arrive from anywhere and be met with something real. Even people who had never set foot in America grew up shaped by its cultural presence, the films, the music, the mythology of starting over, the persistent image of a country that thought of itself as belonging to the world. That symbolic weight is part of what FIFA was purchasing when they awarded the 2026 tournament to North America. They weren't just buying stadiums, they were buying the idea. What the comment sections of World Cup videos reveal in 2026 is something hard to quantify but consistent enough to notice. People aren't angry at America, exactly. Many comments carry something closer to grief, a quiet sadness about something changing that used to feel solid. Words that once orbited naturally around the American brand, openness, welcome, adventure, possibility, are now competing with a different set: unpredictability, restriction, uncertainty, control. Whether that's a fair characterization of current reality or a perception amplified by news cycles and social media, the perception itself is real. And in international tourism, perception and reality have roughly the same economic consequences. A traveler from Brazil or South Korea or Egypt doesn't make their decision based on immigration statistics or State Department reports. They make it based on what they've heard from friends who tried to get visas. They make it based on stories they've seen in the news. They make it based on a gut-level sense of whether the door is open or whether it might close on them once they've committed their money and their time. The lighthouse is still standing. The light is still on. But the fog has gotten thick enough that many ships are choosing a different route rather than risk it. The most thoughtful observers of this situation keep returning to the same core observation. Trust is asymmetric. It accumulates slowly through years of consistent positive interactions. It erodes fast through a much smaller number of negative signals. The structure of American soft power, the genuine global affection the country had built up over decades, isn't destroyed. The supports are still in place. But once people start hearing sounds from below, the calculation changes. Some will still cross without hesitation. Others will find an alternative route. And some will simply wait to see what develops, which is itself a form of absence. And in the hospitality business, absence is measured in empty beds and unspent dollars. What the 2026 World Cup is revealing, if we're honest about what the data is actually showing, is that the reservoir of goodwill America, accumulated in the global imagination, has been drawing down faster than it's been refilling. That doesn't mean it's empty. It doesn't mean the relationship between America and the rest of the world is broken or even fundamentally hostile. But it does mean that something once taken entirely for granted, the assumption that America was obviously naturally automatically the place the world wanted to gather, is no longer quite so obvious or automatic. It requires tending. And right now, in the lead up to the biggest soccer tournament in history, the tending isn't happening at the scale the moment requires. The matches will happen. The stars will show up. Billions of people will watch on television and streaming platforms. FIFA will collect its revenues. There will be iconic moments, stunning upsets, goals that get replayed for decades. But the question that lingers, the one that matters beyond any final scoreline, is what this all says about the relationship between a global event and the country hosting it. The 2026 World Cup was an opportunity for America to present itself to the world in a very specific way, as a place still open to the planet, still capable of hosting a genuine global gathering, still the kind of country where the world could come together and celebrate something shared. That opportunity is still partly available, but it has been complicated in ways nobody fully anticipated back in 2018 by the accumulation of exactly those small cracks that no one stopped to patch in time. Big, slow shifts in national perception rarely announce themselves with a single dramatic event. They accumulate through 100,000 small decisions, each one seeming trivial in isolation, each one contributing to a pattern that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. A family in Argentina chooses to watch from home. A group of fans from Nigeria decides the uncertainty isn't worth the financial risk. A travel agency in Seoul quietly scales back its World Cup packages. A European fan organization files a legal complaint against the governing body of the sport itself. None of those individual decisions makes front pages anywhere, but collectively they are writing a story. And the 2026 World Cup just happens to be the moment when enough of those decisions appeared in the same frame for the world to see them clearly. Whether that story has a different ending is still genuinely an open question. What isn't in question is that the answer will be written not by what happens inside the stadiums, but by what millions of people around the world decide, about how they feel, about whether the welcome is real, about whether the door that was promised open is actually open. That's the story behind the story of the 2026 World Cup, and it's a story that will outlast the tournament by quite some time.